Thank you. Glad to be here. This is, telling somebody this is the nicest weather I've experienced. I come from Chicago since probably October. We haven't had this warm weather since then. It's very nice. You guys are probably saying, oh no, it's getting hot, but I'm happy. Before I was the Gallagher person traveling around talking to people, I was the risk management director at Wheaton College outside Chicago. It's kind of a sister school in some ways, certainly in beliefs and so on. As the director of risk management, actually before that, I spent about 10 years as a youth minister. So I really enjoyed that. I talked with middle schoolers and high school students. And when I switched and started working with collegiate risk management, I was afraid that I would lose all my good stories because of working with middle schoolers and high school. That's always some adventure going on. And I discovered that instead I got a lot of even better stories because college students do all kinds of foolish things that only they have more power to do it, like driving and voting and things like that, that really very unusual things can happen when they exercise those privileges. So I came here from the ministry, essentially, into risk management. There's still a lot of prayer that goes on, but in ministry, there's an expression that I want to make sure you keep in mind today, okay? The role of the pastor. Anybody know how this statement goes? Finish it for me if you can. The role of the minister is to comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comfortable. So I don't know which category you fall in today. I don't know Lipscomb well enough to know whether you really have a lockdown and you on your events planning that you do really check all the risk management boxes, in which case you can sit back and say, yeah, I've got it covered, that's us. He's comforting me, I'm not feeling afflicted. And if you don't have those boxes checked, maybe I'll see people taking notes and say, I need to call a couple of people about this. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. I don't really know you as an audience yet to know what's buttoned down and what's not for you. So when Kathy asked me to come and talk a little bit about doing camps, doing events, it reminded me of, well, those of us of a certain age will remember, the guy on the left is whom? Anybody recognize a very young, who said that? Mickey Rooney. Anybody under 30 know who that is? He actually just passed away last year. He's in lots and lots and lots of films. Incidentally, who's the person on the right? That's Judy Garland. Mickey Rooney and Judy Garland were in many, many, many movies together, and they really did a fine job. They called each other their psychic twins. They really liked each other as actor and actress. Many things together. Mickey Rooney was famous for doing a bunch of films called the Andy Hardy films way back in the 30s. And the character would often be somebody who was having problems even along with his family, or in one episode, he was part of an orphanage, and he and Judy Garland and the other kids were, the orphanage is going to go under because they don't have enough money coming in. And they thought, what can we do here? One of the things we like to do is act and sing, and all these adults don't get that. They want us to go to technical college. They said it was the line of the movie. And so they said, what can we do to raise money for the orphanage? I know, let's put on a show. And of course they have an old barn and it's filled with costumes, and they get a stage set up and they develop lines and they do a show and they raise enough money to save the orphanage. So sometimes when I think about events and camps and special things, I think about what we're really talking here is let's put on a show. We have some idea that we want to do this thing for the institution that would help carry out our mission, at least our departmental mission, if not thinking as broadly as the institution. So we're going to put on a show. Well, we're not a bunch of kids in an orphanage now. We have public expectations and there are budgets involved and insurance and all kinds of stuff. So what does it take to put on a good show when you're not Mickey Rooney and Judy Garland? Although I would really like to see Lipscomb put on a show with character. I think you guys could do a good job with that. Some students are pretty creative in that way. Well, there are certain kinds of events that happen on campuses in general. All kinds of stuff at a higher ed institution. This is just a representative sample list. There are events going constantly. You've got your summer and sports camps and music and drama things going on. And outside conference groups are often renting space, either regularly or at Wheaton College. We had 3 churches renting various spaces on campus every Sunday morning. They didn't have a church home. They rent the chapel, another auditorium, and another smaller chapel. 3 going, and they were different. They'd get big enough, get their own place. Another church would move in and start renting. So you could never get parking on a Sunday morning, no matter what happened there. But it was good to see churches going. Special speakers come and go, sometimes controversial, sometimes not. You know, philosophy department says, hey, let's get in famous Dr. So-and-so, and 3 people show up, or 3,000 people show up, and those are both problems in different ways. Sometimes you have intercollegiate club sports that show up. If you happen to be the rugby championship location selected, you have some issues going on. You have admissions events constantly. Did I understand admissions is here? Is anybody from admissions office today? Okay, good. How often would you say you have events? Every single Friday, in terms of incoming students? Just about. But nothing other than Fridays?
And we have people coming in every day.
Every day. That's okay. That's what I thought. All right. What about alumni and advancement? Anybody here from that kind of a department? Do you call it advancement here? Some places call it fundraising or development, or what's it called here? Development. Okay. Anybody here from development? I didn't see any hands. They're busy developing. Okay. They're getting money. Keep it up. Don't stop now. Development actually usually has many events going on. They usually do something around homecoming and something around commencement, and sometimes there's a family weekend or some other kinds of things. In fact, at many schools, development and advancement have almost as much going on as athletics in terms of the people coming to the campus constantly. There are all kinds of athletics recruits as well. Did I hear athletics is here? Who from athletics is here? Right in front of me? A couple, 3, 4? Okay, good. Athletics has usually many events going on. How often would you say you have recruits coming to campus? Weekly? About weekly. So there's stuff going on. This is only a partial list. When I was at Wheaton, I don't know what you have here, but there were so many events going on constantly and requests for new events from the music department, from the drama department, from different academic departments. Hey, so-and-so, this great geologist is passing through. We didn't know he was going to be here, but since he's in town, we've scrambled to throw together a lecture. And what did everybody need? Every single one of those people needed what? Space. Everyone wants a slot, a classroom, whatever. So we actually, I don't know what you guys do here. Maybe you can tell me. We had a group called... Okay, so we won't be walking over there anytime soon. Sorry about that. We had a group called, my own ears are ringing, the Events Scheduling Committee. Yeah, anybody have the equivalent of that here at Lipscomb? Who are the events people here? Raise your hands, okay? All right. I sat on the Events Scheduling Committee as risk management at Wheaton because sometimes people would come up with ideas that in terms of space were no big deal, but in terms of risk was a big concern. So usually the physical plant, public safety, campus police sat on this group. By the time I was done, several years of serving on that committee, my considered firm opinion was that we needed to cut the number of events on our campus by at least 30%. I just don't think we're helping the mission. Anybody, have you felt that way? Anybody wish you could cut events? How many people think we should add events at Lipscomb College? How many people think you could cut events by 10, 15, 30% and be better off? Okay, I can only count hands one time per person. See, everybody thinks that we need more. And in fact, that might not be the best way to carry out the mission. I'm just throwing it out there. I don't intend to get involved in intramural disputes on the issue, but I have been where you have been. I know how it feels. The answer is not always to add more facilities and more events, but to make the events you do really good ones, even better ones, and improve. So what do I mean by that? Well, in most events, there are 3 basic risk management tasks that you're trying to accomplish, all right? Actually, this is most things that you do at an institution. Kathy, you can speak to this if you like, but this is kind of the big 3. In fact, I would use a form of this to describe what I did for a living to people. You'd be amazed at how difficult it is to explain to people what I do for a living as a risk manager. So what do you do anyway? Well, I deal with insurance. Oh, and then the eyes glaze over and they back slowly away. I mean, if you get such an entertaining person like Brandon, it's interesting to talk to him about stuff. But other people, when you say insurance, okay, I'm going to go talk to somebody else. But basically, it's 3 parts. 1, I try to figure out how to keep people from being hurt or property from being damaged. I should also include reputation from being damaged in there. The second thing is, well, if I fail in the first, I am trying to figure out how to get money to pay for the damages, the broken stuff, the broken people, It's hard to pay for reputation. And finally, then the last one is the one that is most important. Protect the reputation. If I ask, and I go around asking people, I speak all over the country and the world actually, and I ask risk managers, what is the single biggest risk that higher education faces from your perspective? And not here, I was talking to your attorney, and he says, well, it's not here, and it wasn't at Wheaton either, but most places in higher ed, they will tell you, number one risk facing them is student alcohol abuse. No question, number one. It's about 80 up to 90% of general liability insurance claims are alcohol related, and something close to 90% of sexual assaults are alcohol related. Now that does not seem to be as big an issue at Lipscomb, and certainly was not at Wheaton as it is elsewhere. But if I talk to a random operational risk manager like Kathy or I somewhere out there, that's what they'll tell me. But if I ask a VP of finance, any people from the finance world in here today? The accounting side, the finance people, they're out spending the money that development is raising, or trying to keep it from being spent. What do you think their number one risk is when they say, this is what I'm most worried about? This is very consistent every time I talk to people. It's not alcohol abuse. That's something for Kathy to worry about. It's revenue. How do I meet the budget? And more specifically, very, very concerned about enrollment. How do I hit our target numbers for enrollment and tuition? That's a big problem and will continue to be a big problem for traditional higher education institutions because perhaps you've seen the numbers. Who's here from admissions? What's the demographic curve look like for 18 to 24-year-olds in this country over the next 15 years? It's shaped like this, okay? It goes down. And the number of schools in this country has stayed level and the number of seats available at the schools is going up because people are adding residence halls. They're adding buildings of all kinds. Maybe they're renovating a large building, a residence hall. I don't know who would do that, but most of the time it has to be over the summer and most people just can't pull that off in 8 to 12 weeks. But it's truly a remarkable institution that could pull that off. The difficulty with the demographics is that there are fewer and fewer students, traditional students, going for the same number or even more spaces. Essentially, higher education is playing a reverse game of musical chairs, where we're adding chairs, or the people are getting fewer, and we need somebody to sit in our chair to stay in the game. And that's a very difficult place to be. That really has VPs of finance worried. But if you just talk to the presidents, the chancellors, the CEOs of institutions, they're not terribly worried about the drinking students. They're not even all that worried about the enrollment. They would say, I've got people for that. All right? What do you think the CEOs and the presidents are worried about? Without fail, they will say reputation of the institution is what makes the other things worth caring about. Failures at these other risk levels affect the bottom line of reputation. If our reputation goes, it's over. It doesn't matter anymore. I'll give you an example of that from the secular world. I should say secular in the sense of non-higher. I'm afraid to walk over there now. Stop. It's like a dog with that little thing around the yard. My cameraman is happy about that. So, Arthur Andersen was, what were they famous for a number of years ago? One of the top what's in the world. They're an accounting firm, right? All right, Arthur Andersen is no longer an accounting firm. In fact, Arthur Andersen no longer exists. Anybody remember why? They were the main auditor for a company out of Texas with a big letter E in their name called Enron. Any of you of a certain age remember Enron? What was Enron all about? What do you remember about Enron? Anybody? I'm a pastor. I'm looking for feedback from my audience here. What did Enron do for a living? They did oil and gas, and they did a lot of financial trading on the oil and gas. It turned out they were really shady in their trades. They did a lot of illegal things, but they were really, really good at it. In fact, they were so good at it, it was very difficult to figure out that they were illegal. When I was in business school, we had a class assignment once, and 4 of us in a small group chased one Enron transaction to try to figure out what had happened and how did they fool people. And this is out of a sea of thousands of similar transactions. It took 4 of us an entire semester part-time to follow this transaction through 36 different shell corporations established with the names of Disney characters and Star Wars movie characters and things like that. They were moving $1 billion around like a pea under a walnut shell all over the place until finally they ended up, it had to do with a hydroelectric power plant in Canada and a bunch of a $1 billion overnight loan from a bank or two. And it worked out that they were simply trying to avoid tax in income tax in Canada on some transaction they were doing. That was what the 36 companies were all about. It took forever to figure that out. Enron was audited by Arthur Andersen. Arthur Andersen signed off on more than one letter that said, hey, this is an unqualified, yeah, this is what their finances really are like. That was not true. When Enron finally went under, Arthur Andersen was put on trial for facilitating the fraud. And they were on trial for several years, where people said, hey, Arthur Andersen must have been in bed with Enron, must have been getting some kickback for this. There's no way a big accounting firm like this could get fooled. Well, what do you think happened? If you were an accountant and your boss said, we need to hire a new accounting company this year, who would you look at? There's KPMG, there's Ernst & Young, there's Arthur Andersen, who's on trial in federal court. Who am I not going to hire? Okay, I don't know who I'm going to hire, but probably not going to hire Arthur Andersen. Meanwhile, accounting firms are structured like partnerships, which means they come together with their abilities and they join up, but there's no particular contract that says they have to be there. A lot of the partners were hauled away to other accounting firms. What did Arthur Andersen have left? They don't own lots of factories or anything. All Arthur Andersen had was its reputation, and that was gone. Most people don't even remember that the end result of the federal trial was that Arthur Andersen was exonerated. They were found innocent. They said, no, they were really fooled, and Enron was so good at this. But see, by that time, it didn't matter anymore. And that's what I want to stress to you. It doesn't matter how good you are at an institution. It only takes a couple of really bad, embarrassing screw-ups, and your reputation takes such a serious hit. So, I don't know if I'm comforting the afflicted or afflicting the comfortable by saying this, but I'm trying to get your attention. Now, there's another saying they say in the pastorate. It's not just comfort of the afflicted, but it's preaching to the choir. How many people know that expression? He's preaching to the choir. What does that mean? Somebody says, oh, he's preaching to the choir. What does he mean by that? He's preaching to people who agree with him. In a church, especially old cathedrals, the choir would stand behind the pastor, clapping and singing and whatever they did. And if the pastor wanted to make sure that the congregation agreed with him, he turned around and preached to the choir, because they're right there. They're behind him saying amen all the way. So I may be preaching to the choir here this morning, even though I'm facing forward. When somebody was talking about background checks, I said, well, there went slides 5, 6, and 7 for me right there. So we may go faster through this, Kathy, than we thought. But feel free to stop me anytime with questions or, hey, that's not the way it works here, or what do you mean by that? Okay, is that a deal for me? I appreciate it if you would. So when we have 3 major tasks of risk management, how does that translate into events? Well, we could say we have this list of things to do with any kind of event we're trying to do. First of all, you want to have somebody who's responsible, who's in charge of it, a responsible party. Second of all, you need to have somebody at the institution, at Lipscomb, who is the liaison or has oversight. If the person who's planning the event is from Lipscomb, then the oversight would be their boss, I assume, or maybe if you're planning a big event, the events scheduling committee. What do you call yourselves? Event scheduling? Event management. I like that. All right, not just scheduling, but actual get your hands dirty and manage this event. So that group is going to be in charge of some of these things. You'll have to tell me more as we go through this afternoon what you do, how you manage. It's hard to manage. It's, the old expression about herding cats comes to mind with a large institution. That's probably as it should be. You also need some kind of a contract, an understanding of what is and is not going to occur. For instance, at Lipscomb, I'm going to guess that very few of your, this is, by the way, unlike some events with some institutions in Colorado recently, I'm going to suggest that probably none of your events have marijuana consumption approved at them. I'm just a guess, but I'm thinking that's probably true. Even though you live across the border from Kentucky, which has its largest agricultural export is not corn, and it's not even tobacco, but it's marijuana. Happens to be illegal export, but still, highest by volume. So you've got big issues to talk about the event scheduling. Who's in charge of this? In Colorado, they have legalized the consumption of marijuana in public, and now it's some of the schools are running into a really interesting, difficult problem. Their career services department. Anybody here from career services or whatever you call it here? Helping students find jobs and placement. What do you call that on this campus? Career development. Is anybody here from career development? Okay, well, you're glad you're not in Colorado. They're having problems placing students now because anywhere the students go in public, they're exposed to marijuana fumes and they're failing drug tests even though they don't take drugs. So if you're a student and you want to get a job, you better never go out anywhere in Colorado. That's one of their problems. Nobody expected that end result. So you've got to have oversight. You need to have a contract, some agreement with the external people or with yourselves on how you're going to conduct your business. And then you need to have some policies that manage so that we make sure the contract terms are followed. Hey, you said you weren't going to do this thing. This is our policy. We don't do this thing. Don't do that thing. Same thing with external people as well. Bring them in, you have a contract. And then you'd like to have some kind of source of funds if things go wrong. Insurance. If it's an outside group, you'd really like it if the insurance were not yours. Let's get them to pay for their own losses would be great. Wisdom and prayer are really good to accompany all of these things. That's something that I don't always put down, but I think I should. Those things need to happen. So you need these parts in place to have any kind of event. Doesn't really matter what kind of event. There are also some other systems that we put in place. Now, there are all kinds of ways you have increased risk. YouTube is a wonderful source for very unusual human-threatening behavior these days. If you watch certain YouTube videos, you wonder if there will be a next generation of students. But then you think, kind of a social Darwinism is in play. The people who are that stupid, that young, probably won't have children. So I don't have to worry about stupidity perpetuating itself. When you have areas or events that have these kinds of risk, it's kind of like the person using his jet-powered roller skates on the roller coaster. If you have minors involved, your risk goes way up. Believe it or not, if you have food, particularly if you're selling the food, the risk can go up. If you're catering the food, the risk is not as high, but still it's there. If you have international travel involved, if you have even remote or challenging domestic travel. I just had a call yesterday in our consult from a school up in the Northwoods. They are planning a major camping trip as a new requirement this year for all of their resident assistants. How many resident assistants, RAs, do you have at Lipscomb, give or take? 42? Who said that? Is that student development? Okay, 42. They've got 66 at this school, and they're taking every one of them into the Boundary Waters Canoe Wilderness area for their training for this fall. Anybody here been to the BWCA in northern Minnesota? Isn't it beautiful? Would you take 66 people there as a group? I would not either. I used to take trips all the time, lead kids. I've led kids all over the world, but 66 people in that wilderness area, they have a per site limit of 9 anyway, so they're going to have about, what's that, 11, 12, how many groups? Small groups. And how about their training for their leaders? What happens if something goes wrong way in the backwoods? That sounds like a great event. They're going to really have to risk manage that one. That's an event that the events committee approved on condition that certain kinds of internal contracts and rules were followed. And now the student development folks are asking, how can we fulfill this contract imposed on us? We don't really know if we can have the wilderness training and all that other stuff in place. So they're wondering about that. If you have any kind of overnight stay, particularly if you combine things, overnight stays by minors in the wilderness with food, for sale to the public, now you're stretching it. But one of the worst situations I ever had at Wheaton was a claim that called in. These things always happen at, I should say, 4:45, and at 4:20 on a Friday afternoon in Colorado. But for the rest of us, it's 5 o'clock. Some of you got that. A little slow, that's all right. It was the 4th of July weekend. Actually, it was after the 4th of July. I think it was Monday the 5th. I don't remember what year it was. You could look it up. And I got a phone call. And it was not the kind of phone call that risk managers like to get. It was the head of our summer camp in northern Wisconsin saying, we had a little incident over the weekend. Great. Tell me about what happened. And he said, well, a couple of our counselors took out a group of 10-year-old boys to the woods, and they were about 3 hours canoe into the middle of nowhere. This is our event that we did, definitely ours. And one of the jobs of the counselors is to take away from the campers anything like a weapon, anything like weird things. They bring Japanese throwing stars in case of bears in the woods, whatever, and anything flammable or dangerous. So they made sure the kids, it was 4th of July weekend. You see where I'm about to go with this? They made sure that none of the students had any fireworks or firecrackers or anything like that, because out in the woods where there's a fire hazard, you didn't really know what can happen. I said, so why are you calling me? What did happen? He said, well, they took away all the kids, but at midnight on the 3rd of July going into the 4th, they said to all their 10-year-olds, hey, we've got a surprise for you. And the 2 counselors dumped out of their bag huge numbers of bottle rockets. Are you familiar with bottle rockets where you light them and they zoom across? They zoom across, say, a clearing in the woods where, say, your counselors have stacked up aluminum canoes as a wall so you can fire through and between and over them at one another. And wouldn't it be cool to have a bottle rocket war in the woods at midnight with 10-year-old boys? Well, the 10-year-old boys thought it was awesome. These are the greatest counselors ever. And it was awesome. You know, what's the old expression your mother always says? Everything's a lot of fun until somebody loses an eye or gets hurt. Yeah, so when you have these bottle rockets exploding off these aluminum canoes in the middle of the night, it's great until one kid stood up to see what was going on. And a bottle rocket flew into his mouth and blew up in his mouth. Well, it blew out several of his teeth. It nearly blew out the back of his throat. He came, as we found out later, this close from having major arteries and veins blown apart in his mouth. He was in bad shape. It's now 1 in the morning. You got a kid bleeding in the dark. You're 3 hours canoe from anywhere, any kind of helpful. So they packed this kid up with a wet towel from the cold lake water to try to stop the bleeding. They bundle everybody into canoes, paddle furiously through the night, 3 hours paddling in the dark with 10-year-olds. Kids are crying, people are upset. The counselors they know they're in a lot of trouble. And when they finally get to a road, I think somehow they were dropped off, so they didn't have wheels of their own. They had to hitchhike. So I don't know about you, but if you were driving at 4 in the morning on the 4th of July in the remote backwoods of northern Wisconsin, and suddenly out in the road jumped a bunch of screaming, arm-waving, bloody 10-year-old boys, would you stop? Would you stop? Somebody did. Somebody stopped for them. And they took this lad to the hospital. They treated him, tried to replace him his teeth, fixed him up. His parents showed up. They got a call. I get a call on Monday morning from the camp director. He says, what should we do about this problem? He said, actually, what he really wanted to know is, do you think, Vince, that I should pay for the parents' hotel bill? Now, what, Kathy, do you think that I said? I said, pay for their hotel bill, pay for their gasoline, pay for any food they choose. If you see them eye the vending machine, rush over with quarters. What can I get you? What can I get you? And everything you can do to help this family out. This is a clear liability case, absolutely our problem. What failed there? We had planned an event. Was the event one we shouldn't have done? Events approved it. They approve it every year. We'd come off without a hitch most of the time. Would a background check for our volunteers have picked up this problem? Nope. All right. What could we do about this? Better training. Believe me, this is Exhibit A in our training for counselors now. But sometimes stuff just happens, and it goes wrong, and there's all the planning you can do. We still run a risky kind of enterprise. It's a risky institution. We deal with people who are not yet mature. We used to say every September, we'd sigh and look at each other when the freshmen came on campus and remind ourselves of the famous saying, each new generation is a fresh wave of barbarians who must be civilized. Because every May you graduate 25% of your most mature, and every September you take in 25% of your least mature, and our job is to crank those percentages over every year. So it may be that you planned the event well, it may be that you screened your volunteers and did all this stuff, but you're still doing risky stuff. And sometimes it's hard to predict what's going to happen. If you have large crowds at football games or other kinds of events, if you have sales to the public of tickets or food. I walked into our art department one time, and they were they had a spaghetti sale. They were selling spaghetti to the general public, which is a pretty big no-no without a permit. But worse, they were doing it in the whimsical Italian art way, which means they were cooking the spaghetti over their hot plates that they did the inking and press work with. Anybody done art? Okay. The amount of chemicals oozing off of those hot plates was unbelievable. I wouldn't have touched that spaghetti. Well, it's an annual tradition. You can't mess up our annual tradition. We do this spaghetti sale, we're a big fundraiser. We have to find a different way to do that. The risk is too high. So one of the biggest risks you'll run into for events is transportation. How many people here deal with transport in one way or another? Hands up. When I say deal with it, do you schedule it? Do you drive? Do you appoint drivers? All the above? What do you do?
Schedule it and also drive some. Schedule.
So tell me about your transportation. Who is allowed to drive on university business?
What we do with our kids is we get the university shuttles, and so that's driven by a university.
So when you say your kids, I don't know what you're talking kids or college kids?
Kids.
Okay, little kids, all right. So we've got minors and transport, two big ones on my list, okay. So
The adult that drives that is somebody that's contracted with the university, either with our shuttle service here or someone that they use.
So are they an employee of Lipscomb?
Yes.
Okay.
And then we occasionally have to put our counselors in a car driven by either the camp director or one of the counselors themselves.
Who owns the car?
In that case, it would be like I would drive.
Your own car?
I would drive my own car with the counselors, but we don't do that unless we have to because we don't own a criminal with us.
How many people end up using a personally owned vehicle for Lipscomb business at one time or another? A few. That is a risk that sometimes is worth taking and sometimes not. But what do you think a risk manager's concern with that would be? Personally owned vehicle being used for business.
Yeah,
If you have a wreck, what happens? Who's going to be paying for that? The owner of the vehicle. That's absolutely right. Whether you believe it or not. Lipscomb will probably have auto coverage that can step in on top of it, but only after yours is completely exhausted. At least that's the way it is in most places, Kathy. So many schools I know say absolutely no personal use of your vehicles because we can't cover you in case of insurance. If you're hauling 4 or 5 university employees who are on workers' comp or 4 or 5 kids, they're going to sue us, or they could sue us. I've had friendly lawsuits where people said, look, I really like Wheaton College. I don't want to sue you, but my medical insurance is completely exhausted. I'm shot, and I got to get money from somewhere. I'm making a friendly lawsuit against you. And I said, well, I'm sorry, but because you're riding an individually owned vehicle, you're going to have to go after them first. Just the way it works, the way insurance works. So it's to be avoided if at all possible, at least at most schools. I don't know if you have a written policy about that somewhere, or...
It's very discouraged if we can find another way to...
Well, we don't ever put our camper kids in there. It would be our counselors who know that they are doing it of their own accord, and that's only a last.
Yeah, that's good. I don't know what written transportation policies you have at Lipscomb in terms of that kind of thing, but it turns out when you're hauling other people's minor kids around, you really have to get careful about it. You have to get permission slips and waivers so the parents know that you're hauling them. You got to be very careful. One of the things with minor children you have to be very careful about is custody issues. You ever run into that here? If you're hauling kids from camp to somewhere else, you've got to make sure you drop them off at the right parent's house. Because so whoever has custody rights, if they don't have custody, they could get really irritated and decide that they're going to sue about that. We've had cases where parents picked up a child and the kid went, oh, Daddy, take me home, and it wasn't the right, it was actually an abduction situation. But the child doesn't know the difference. So you've got to really know your minors when other people are around. You really have to have policies and procedures for that. You got to know what kind of vehicles you're using and who owns them and who's insuring them and how far you're going and what time of day. Do you have a policy for transport here on certain hours when you can drive or not drive Lipscomb vehicles? Anybody know? Kathy, do you know? All right. They don't seem to know. We should flash that up. Can anybody tell me? Are there forbidden times to drive?
Our permissions, why don't you talk about that?
I don't know.
Okay.
You're referencing like I should know.
Well, that's all right. I'll tell you what other schools do and why they do it. Other schools will often say, you can't drive a university vehicle after, say, 12 or 1 at night or before 5 in the morning without a signature from a vice president. And that is because either you will be very tired or other people will be very tired on the road, and both of those increase your risk dramatically. And most of the time, proper planning can avoid that. That's not a critical time to be on the road. If you're driving and you're half hour from home at 12:30 at night, well, you go ahead and come home. Don't stop for the night. But I used to tell, also bad weather, I used to tell our sports teams particularly, hey, if you feel you need to stop because of bad weather or something, just go get a hotel, order pizza for the team, and send me the bill. I'll be glad to pay that bill from a risk management standpoint rather than trying to clean up the pieces in the mess if you have an accident from pushing on through. So the reason that happened to us is we did have an accident with people pushing on through. Anybody here play hockey? Like ice hockey? Is that a thing in Tennessee? I played ice hockey for 2 years in college. I would say I played badly but enthusiastically. And under this beard are a couple of big scars I got for playing hockey. Hockey is cheap late at night. Like, why would that be? Well, because they have to keep the rinks cold all the time. And so they don't make any money at 2 and 3 in the morning. If you really want to get a good hockey match going on with your friends, you rent ice time at 2 in the morning. It's really cheap. Nobody wants to play hockey at 2 in the morning, but you can afford it then. So a lot of college club sports who do hockey will play late at night. So we had a group who decided to go have a match with somebody downstate, probably 3 hours away. Their match started at 2 a.m., because that's when the ice was really cheap. And they played for an hour. Hockey is a pretty violent, active sport. They were exhausted. And they finally decided to come home at 2 in the morning. We don't really know what happened, but sometime around 4 or 4:30, they ran at full highway speed into the back of a disabled semi on the side of the interstate. We don't really know what happened. Nobody was around to tell us. The driver was in intensive care for 6 weeks afterwards. He lived. His girlfriend stuck by him, and that's when we knew they were going to get married, and they'd been married for a while. Brandon, I would like to say that he made a full recovery, but he eventually became an actuary. So but the students, most of them were okay. A couple of them had some very serious injuries. One of them had 27 subsequent surgeries, and one student was killed. That was a difficult time for Wheaton College. We made a lot of changes to our transportation policy after that. It would have been nice to know and make them beforehand for our kind of events. The lawsuit we got was from the student who had 27 surgeries. He said, I hate to see you guys, but I'm out of money. I need some help with this. It was awkward because he developed Crohn's disease. Some of you may know what that is. And it was difficult because our attorneys wanted to argue he would have developed the Crohn's disease anyway at that age, and therefore would have had all these surgeries anyway. His attorneys wanted to say it was our fault because it was triggered by the trauma and so on. You don't want to ever get in a situation where you're trying to tell your student they would have gotten sick anyway and had all these surgeries anyway. The upshot of it was we changed our transportation policies because that was a major source of risk for us. Anytime transportation is involved, your risk goes way up for an event. It's always nice to eliminate that if you can. I'd be glad to talk about that with you further if you like. But that's one of the major risks I would talk about. Another risk is food, believe it or not. The old, is this heaven? No, it's Iowa. Remember that movie about the baseball team? If you build it, they will come. Well, we found that if you feed them, they will come. So here's some questions to ask if food is involved. Are you catering it? If you're not, who prepared it? Was it to be sold or given away? There's a big difference, actually, in giving food away to people who just come by for a potluck and selling it to the public as if you have the right to sell. That requires usually a license or a permit. Do you have a policy on food, how you manage food at the institution? Some schools do and some schools don't. It's surprisingly common that it's needed. It's surprisingly uncommon to have a policy about food. I can get you some samples that other schools have. But how do you keep hot foods hot and the cold foods cold if you don't have a permit and you don't know about this? How do you train preparers and servers? How do you do sanitation so that cleaning up after and so it doesn't make a mess for somebody? These are things when a Mickey Rooney and a Judy Garland say, let's put on a show. We're going to do let's raise money for our drama team by doing a spaghetti supper. Well, there are lots of reasons maybe that can be done, but maybe not. It's a lot easier, I can tell you, to do a bake sale. It turns out that baked goods are far easier to prepare safely and sell to the general public. But anytime you sell to the general public, you got to be careful about permits and so on. Anybody, does this resonate with anybody? Am I comforting the afflicted or afflicting the comfortable at the moment? So, we got these bake sales, Jaggard. Move on, he says. So, all right, that's a major area of concern as well. How many people here interact with outside groups who want to rent space or hold in a camp or they're coming in to do a concert? How many people do that here? Oh, quite a few. The events folks are all about it, right? I'm guessing you have a standard contract. Most schools have a standard contract that says, Here's what you can expect. Here's what we can expect. What are some elements of the standard contract? What are some things that the rest of us might not be aware of that's in the standard usage agreement? What do you call it? Usage agreement? Rental agreement? Send them a contract. What's in the contract? A lot of legal stuff, always. What else?
For sending contracts to the external groups, so there's a portion on liability insurance.
Tell me about the portion on liability insurance for external groups. You got a group coming in. What's an example? What would be a group that wants to?
Like the Red Cross breakfast.
Okay, Red Cross is doing a breakfast. What for?
For fundraising.
Okay, and so they're selling food.
Well, no, it would just be, here's the venue, and it's a catered breakfast.
Catered breakfast, but they're charging more than the caterers do for, okay, they're raising money. Gotcha. So tell me about how this works. Because other people here might bring in coaches to do camps or other kinds of things. How does this work for Red Cross breakfast?
The contract?
Yeah.
It's just line down what's allowed, what's not allowed, and we don't allow alcohol on campus.
No alcohol, okay.
The whole list of those, and then there's the whole liability.
Tell me about that. Tell me about the liability part.
We require external groups to provide their own liability insurance, saying Lipscomb as additional insurance for Lipscomb.
So if something happened at the Red Cross breakfast and the Red Cross got sued and Lipscomb got sued as the host, because that happens, people sometimes tend to sue, your coverage is coming through the Red Cross. This is important to remember. That's why I wanted to push on it, because other groups do the same thing. If you have a very famous soccer coach who wants to come here and run a soccer camp, and it's going to be a third-party entity, they need to have a contract like that. Do those kinds of things come through you guys too, or does athletics do their own thing? Or if somebody wanted to rent space in philosophy department, would they have to come to you guys, or could just go through philosophy? They should. Say that louder. They should, yes. That often does not happen at other schools, but it should. You're right. So go ahead. Anything else that's special to know about this contract? What does it say about the other party's volunteers, Red Cross volunteers? Anything special? What if the Red Cross were not doing a breakfast, but were doing a camp with minors? Would your standard contract? Did you guys have background checks? I just heard somebody talking about that. Who do you do background checks for at this institution? Yeah.
We do background checks for all the workers that are employed by Sodexo, which is the food service operator.
So you do background checks on some third-party company employees as well who are here regularly, correct? Okay. What does that background check consist of? Anybody know? Who does the back? Where was HR? They leave? I don't see HR. Yeah.
The ones who are doing for camp they'll do criminal or local. There are a couple of other areas I can't remember exactly, but we're checking the criminal and the court records and.
Okay. I'm curious about this because I'm a 2 cheers for background checks kind of a person. I'm not yet sure they deserve 3 cheers. I know this, that if something happens to, say, a minor on your campus, or somebody steals some money and runs off to a non-extraditable country, I know you look really foolish in the news if they say, did you do a background check? And you didn't. I know that looks awful. But I also know that 99-something% of background checks never detect anything worth talking about. So that's a lot of money and time and effort. We were asked earlier, should we do background checks on volunteers every year, every 2 years, every 3 years? Well, I don't know. How much do you want to roll the dice? I mean, I would probably do them every year, but I'd also run motor vehicle checks on all your drivers every year too, and that's expensive also. What are you looking for? Or you think you'll find it this year as opposed to last year? You know, let's face it, there are background checks and there are background checks. All right, if you want to get a background check to teach Sunday school at your local church, most sophisticated churches now run background checks on their volunteers, but that means going down to the local county sheriff or police department, getting a couple of thumbprints and paying $50, maybe less, and they'll do a background check in this county. Most of the checks are not connected with one another on a state basis, much less. Anybody here from public safety or security? Can you tell me, do you know anything about background checks? You get involved in that here at all?
We run background checks just for all of our employees.
So how extensive are they?
Well, they have to get fingerprinted, and then also on top of that, psychological evaluations.
Oh man, I just disqualified half the higher ed people I know. Psychological evaluations. That's good. That's more extensive than most people do. Most people say, yep, the county sheriff said no problem. Well, of course, in higher ed, especially with all your students, they're coming from all over the country. Are you doing background checks in their local state? How about where they lived last year? And since juvenile records are typically sealed, you're not getting anything older than their 18th birthday. And what are you going to do if you find something? Are you going to fire somebody, not hire them? Famous case on that was, I think it was Penn State, was it not? The famous case where they decided to start running background checks on all their employees. And they didn't like it very much, but they uncovered this one very revered math professor, double PhD, mathematics, famous and well-liked professor, one of the most popular professors on campus. Turned out he committed triple murder in the state of Texas when he was 40 years ago. He served his time and was released from prison and became an excellent math professor. And they fired him, but not for the murders, because he was very clearly reformed. They fired him for lying on his employment application, saying he'd never committed a felony, because he had. Now, whether the higher education institution was better off or not for firing one of their best math professors, I guess I would say is an exercise for the reader. But I'm not entirely sure. I'm a sort of fan of background checks. You can hardly not do them. But I also have very low expectations for what they'll find. If you really want to do a background check or have one done on you, apply for the Secret Service. All right, $50,000, and 6 months later, they will have interviewed your kindergarten teacher and discovered that when you were 8 years old, you used to pull the wings off of flies. Maybe you're a psychological risk. I mean, there are ways to do background checks if you really want to do it, but they're very expensive. And usually, as the expression goes, the game is not worth the candle. So I throw that out there as the background checks, you almost have to do them, but they're of mixed value. So it's one reason it's difficult to say, yes, absolutely do them every year, or no, you can wait every 3 years. But what are you looking for? You want to be like the bulldog chases cars down the street every day until all of a sudden he catches one and doesn't know what to do with it, That's worth thinking about quite a bit. So I don't know what you've come up with in terms of background checks here, but there's some mixed feelings about that out there in the world. If you've got a non-institutionally owned group coming in to do some kind of event, a camp, a concert, they want to rent space, sounds like you'd run them through this group mainly. Sometimes groups like yours will say, well, athletics, if you have a well-known established coach that wants to come in and do a soccer camp, a basketball camp, we know about them, you handle that. Well, then there's some things you really want to make sure it's in there. You want to make sure that the outside group does have adequate insurance. That includes maybe both a liability and accident. You want to make sure that they have coverage for injury to the participants as well, which may be a separate thing. We can ask Kathy what you've got. We could ask Brandon to place things for you if you like. But there's several different ways to go about that. You want the institution added as an additional insured so their insurance applies. One thing that you might not always think about, but which is sure helpful, do you collect waivers and releases on participants? Do you do that internally? Do you collect waivers and releases for people who participate in club sports here? Anybody here from athletics? Tell me about that one. Nobody's from athletics? Oh, yeah. Intramurals you do, clubs you don't? Do you not have club sports per se?
Club sports go under intramurals.
They're the same kind of thing. And you do collect participation releases?
I don't work with club sports.
Okay.
Yes,
Assuming they do. That makes risk managers nervous. But the thing about intramurals, in my experience, is that students will sign up on a whim, and they'll show up. Their roommate says, hey, we're short somebody for the volleyball game tonight. Can you come fill in? Sure, I'll show up. And then they haven't signed a waiver form. And then we had a basketball game where somebody was driving on the court, and somebody else, they got in a little shoving match, a foul. He got pushed into a basketball stanchion and broke his back. And he had not signed a waiver form. On the other hand, we had a cheerleading club, and we ended up with a difficult lawsuit with him about that. You shouldn't let me play. I hadn't signed a release. Well, the lawyers in the room will appreciate we said you'd been playing for longer than 20 minutes. You were aware of the surface and the playing conditions. You understood the risk. And you assumed it. And that was the argument we took on that. On the other hand, the cheerleader that was dropped from the top of a pyramid, she had signed a waiver, and it was held to be so tight in court that we had what's called summary dismissal of the case. And when she tried to sue again based on, it was malice, that we intentionally tried to drop her. We were like, hey, let's drop her when she gets to the top. She lost that one completely. We were so glad we had a good waiver form for participation. It doesn't always work everywhere. They have to be worded just so. In Illinois, where I worked, there were 21 different pieces of language and so on that had to be included in a waiver for it to be binding, including font size and little warnings at the bottom and things like that. So make sure you've consulted with your attorney about your waiver and release language. Here's what you probably won't get to work. If you have a camp, soccer, whatever, and you have a little slip at the very bottom that says, sign this thing, and this is your simultaneous acceptance to and waiver of and medical release for, it's possible, but it's hard to get all the stuff you need on a proper waiver into that little form and make sure that the parent signs it if so, or the guardian. Make sure that your waiver forms are tight, especially if they're on the application for a kids camp form. Is this making sense to anybody? Anybody comforted or afflicted about this? All right, I'm going to keep going then. Another thing to think about is something called TULIP. Anybody here? This is not a Calvinistic theological argument. 3 or 4 people will laugh at that maybe. I'm a pastor, remember? Total depravity, unlimited, well. TULIP is short for Tenant User Liability Insurance Policy. How many times here do you get requests, oh, this is such a lovely campus, can't we do our wedding on this property? Has that ever happened to you, weddings at Lipscomb? Or family reunions, or birthday parties or something like that? Where does that go if somebody wants to do a wedding on Lipscomb's campus? They come through events as well? And what do you tell them?
Very rarely, only under very special circumstances.
Like it's the president's daughter or something? Okay. All right. Does the president even have a daughter? I don't. So sometimes, though, people will get requests for that. I've seen schools where the athletics department says, hey, the local high school doesn't have enough court space for volleyball. Their young men's volleyball team wants to come rent from us to practice for that. Can we rent space from you? We would have run them through you guys right away. Sometimes although once in a while, athletics would say, sure, just pay us under the table and come use it on Tuesday afternoons. We'll let you in the back door. And this becomes a supplement to the athletics budget. We uncovered that a couple of times. That didn't work well for me from an insurance perspective. But if somebody wants to do a wedding, here's the problem. Lipscomb will want insurance for that event, right? We want to make sure that they've got some kind of coverage in case something goes wrong. On the other hand, most homeowners insurance will not cover third-party locations somewhere else. So if you wanted to have a big birthday party for your grandfather at Lipscomb, because that was his alma mater from 1924, you couldn't do it if the events people say you need insurance, all right? So TULIP, this third-party thing, allows you to buy, as a homeowner, insurance to cover third-party locations. So you could host your wedding, your birthday party, things like that. Fortunately, it's relatively cheap. It's not too expensive. It's fairly easy to get. There's a website called IRMIA, the University Risk Managers Insurance Association. Kathy could point you to. If you knew of somebody who was trying to get insurance for this place, I've known several schools that have really expanded their revenue capabilities for renting space for things like weddings and birthday parties and stuff because they could point to this product where people could get coverage for something for renting the facility. This can also be used for camps, outside groups. It could be used for concerts or performance groups. Mickey Rooney and Judy Garland could have used a TULIP policy to cover their event for the orphanage. So they could get to, it's web-based, about $1 million worth of coverage. I don't sell it, so I'm not touting a product, but Gallagher was involved in developing it because we saw the need for higher ed. So that's something you should know about if you're bringing in outside groups quite a bit. Now let's talk a little bit about minors, because that does make life more exciting for all of us. When minors are involved, here are a few things to think about. You probably have more minors on campus than you think. So raise your hand if you know you have this in your department or area. You've got prospective students or siblings, keep your hands up, or friends of current students who visit campus, children of faculty and staff who live on campus, children or friends who accompany employees to campus. Do you have a bring the daughter to work day or anything like that? Daycare centers. Do you have those at Lipscomb? You don't have daycare, do you? Day and overnight camps or conferences. Your department's involved in that. Athletic programs, use of facilities, pools, playgrounds, locker rooms, fields, gym. Academic enrichment. And we do, music lessons for kids, drama lessons, anything after school programs. Research studies. I need a study sample of 200 children under 10 to test this new therapy on, all right? Special events, field trips, community service projects, kids come to museums, anything like that. Off-campus sponsored activities, you go study abroad and you bring minors, anything like that. Well, that was quite a few hands, thank you. One large school in upstate New York that I can't name, but their mascot is a large fruit, they said, we think, 8 official programs for minors, 8. So then they actually did an assessment to see how often are minors actually on our campus on a regular basis. They had 314 programs for minors on their campus. I will guarantee you that you have more minors on campus than you ever dreamt of, far more than you think. So what happens if you have minors? What could go wrong? So let me tell you about one of my more difficult nights as a risk manager. It was Halloween. These things always happen on these weird holidays, right? It was Halloween night. Actually, it was October 30th into the 31st, because kids never sleep. They stay up all night. The soccer team on our campus had a bunch of recruits that came in, and we were watching some of our guys play. What do you think athletics departments do with recruits from somewhere else? Where do they sleep? What do you do here? If a recruit came in to play basketball or soccer, what's that? You put them in the dorm. Why is that? The experience of hanging out in a college dorm. And who do you have them usually stay with? Yeah, a couple members of the soccer team, right? So that's what happened here. This kid from California, he's 17 years old, senior soccer player. It's still the autumn of his senior year. He's going to turn 18 later, which, by the way, is foreshadowing. He's going to turn 18 later, and he is here on Halloween Eve, and they're screwing around doing what typical college sophomores do late at night, which is anything but sleep or study. And they decided it would be really fun to play a prank on some guys in a floor, a couple of floors above theirs in their residence hall. So they got some costumes. One of them got a gorilla suit, and one of them got, I don't know, some other kind of like He-Man, Thor suit, and they gave this new recruit a chicken costume. So he wore this chicken costume, sneaking upstairs. You know, it's almost like they're setting him up for something. They snuck into one of the rooms of another guy they knew on the floor late at night who was sleeping, and I don't know what they did, but they poured hot water on him or tickled him with feathers or whatever. Anyway, it was big hue and cry, and the chicken and the gorilla and the He-Man Thor rushed out in the hallway for the elevators. All right. While they're rushing towards the end of the hall, suddenly another member of the floor sees these costumed creatures and decides to defend the honor of his floor, as sophomore guys typically do. And he charged down the floor and he tackled the chicken. All right, come on, he called out loud, "Hey, defender, floor raid, floor raid," tackled the chicken. Well, the chicken flew into the wall, snapped his head against the side of the wall. Immediately, a huge laceration opened up in his head inside the costume. He began bleeding all over the place. He was knocked out. So suddenly, this fun prank at midnight on Halloween, you have a 17-year-old knocked out unconscious and bleeding into a chicken costume on your floor. All right? Fast forward about 20 minutes, and I'm home blissfully sleeping, and my phone rings. Risk management. And it's public safety, our security force. And they said, "Hey, we need to talk to you. We need some help." I said, "What on earth can I help you with at 2 in the morning? I pay for stuff tomorrow. I don't respond to emergencies tonight." They said, "Well, we don't know what to do about this." Which I think, Kathy, is an honor. If the campus, when they don't know what to do something and they call me, I would have preferred they call the president, but they said, "We've got actually the way he put it was, "We've got a bleeding chicken here." That's what he said to me. I thought, it's clearly too late for me to be understanding what's going on. Well, what do you think had happened? Why were they calling me? What needed to happen to this chicken? He did need to go to the hospital. How do you get a chicken who's bleeding to the hospital? Transport them how? If they're knocked out, unconscious, what is the protocol on your campus if somebody is unconscious for getting them to a hospital? You don't throw them in the Chevy, you call an ambulance. So they called an ambulance. By the time the ambulance arrives, the chicken, if you'll pardon the pun, is feeling sheepish and sits there with his bloody head under one arm and a costume on. It's kind of dazed. The blood has sort of stopped. He sits on the tailgate of the ambulance and says, "What? I'm not going." Anybody here rode with an ambulance crew or done EMT work? When an ambulance is called, one of two things must happen for them before they'll go away. What are those two things? One, the patient comes with them, or two, the patient signs a release saying, "I don't need you after all." What is the problem for the chicken? He can't sign his own release. So there's an impasse. The ambulance is sitting there like this. Public safety is sitting there wondering what to do. The chicken is sitting there, bleeding slightly. And all the rest of the dorm is now up, milling around, feeling really stupid. They might as well have the fire alarm for all, at least it was a nice night. And they call risk management, say, "What do we do about this?" And I'm telling you, there was nothing for it but to get hold of his parents in California at some ungodly hour of the night and get them to fax us a release before the ambulance would go. Now, I tried. What would you have tried first? Well, he wouldn't go on the ambulance, and he didn't really need to go on the ambulance at that point. I would like to get his head checked out, but that was for other reasons as well. I sent the soccer team with him as well. Who might you assume is his guardian for that period of time? The soccer coach, wouldn't you think? I tried and tried to get hold of the soccer coach. He was much smarter than I am. He did not answer his phone at 2 o'clock in the morning. So after that, we had to have a long conversation about what you do with athletics recruits. Before they can come and stay on our campus, you've got to sign a release from your parents saying, if something happens to me, I'm allowed to seek treatment for you. And we got to thinking about that. I said, if we need those for the athletics recruits, I need them for the admissions recruits too. Because any number of goofy things could happen at midnight. I might need to have treatment. So do you get signed releases now for athletics recruits and admissions recruits that are going to stay overnight on campus? You can wait until you get a call about a chicken bleeding in the middle of the night, or you can figure out how you want to do that now. But you will eventually need that release, I can promise you. So we have them now. That's one thing to think about. What could go wrong? Well, you could end up with a bloody chicken. If you're doing, do you have child care at Lipscomb? Any child care at all? One of the camps has child care? Which camp? Who's it for? Anybody want to own up? Okay. So here are some things you have to think about for child care. I had an assistant provost come to me in August and say, we've got this great idea. It's always these things start with a great idea, right? We're going to put on a show. So he said, here's our idea. We'd like to do a welcome to campus faculty banquet for new faculty. We have quite a few new faculty every year, and we're going to invite all the faculty, and we're going to tell them, bring your spouses, significant others, guests, and we're also going to provide child care so that everybody can come here and be part of the family and the community. Well, see, we do these events to further the mission of the institution, right? And that's why we do anything, in theory. Well, this is a great notion of furthering, you could bring the faculty together, have community. He said, but in order to do that for child care, really? Can we do child care? He said, can we do child care? I said, well, we can do lots of things. It's whether we want to. He said, what do you mean? I said, I can think of off the top of my head 27 different reasons not to do child care. You can think of one really good reason to do it. So it doesn't mean that either one of us, wins. It just means that you're going to have to consider these things. Here's some things to think about. I said, where are you going to do that child care? If you just invite people, he said, well, we got this room off the side of the dining hall. We just clear out of the tables and chairs. It's like the president's dining room or whatever, and we'll do that. I said, but so that facility is not designed for little kids at all. It's not safety-proofed. It's got outlets without covers. It's got tables with corners the height of a child's eye and all that kind of stuff. I remember that because we had a problem with a kid running circles around a ping pong table at a conference once, and he fell forward, and of course he fell forward at eye level into the corner of the ping pong table. That was a bad day. So who is going to take care of it? Well, we're going to hire some sophomore. Let's put out an ad, hey, we'll pay you $10 an hour to babysit for a couple hours for our faculty banquet. I said, so you're just going to take anybody who wants to come make $10? Yeah? Anybody see any problems with that so far? First of all, you're only going to get people, the only thing you know about the people who come is that they like to hang out with other people's kids, which is really creepy in some ways of thinking. But I said, then how are you going to get hold of parents? Say that something happens and a kid, turns blue or starts choking or is listless. How are you going to get hold of the parents? You're going to have to collect contact information and that whole church nursery thing where you give a parents a little buzzer and you flash the number 14, please come to the nursery. Have you seen those in churches? So you're going to do that. What are you going to do about food? All the parents are eating. You're going to feed the kids? What about food allergies? What about gluten intolerances? What about all kinds of stuff? You can't just feed them all jelly beans. That'd be very popular briefly. But what about medical issues? If a child has some kind of a problem, if they've got diabetes or they're allergic to something, how are you going to know that? What are you going to do about it? I said, what about drop-off and pick-up? I mentioned custody issues. What if somebody's supposed to, stay away from their daughter or their son, and there's a custody issue, and they show up to pick them up? How are you going to know who's who? How are you going to not end up with kids missing? How long are you going to do this for? Are you going to do this for an hour, 2 hours, 5 hours? What happens if parents don't show up in time? And the sophomore says, well, I got to go, so see ya. I got a study group. How are you going to entertain the kids? Is there going to be an age difference? Are you going to take nursery kids in strollers and in, what do you call them, bassinets and stuff, as well as 8-year-old kids? How are you going to keep them from hurting one another? These are major, they're quite a longer list than that. When you do childcare, there's a whole bunch of stuff to think about. So you want to, if you're thinking about doing childcare in any form, think long and hard about that, because the risks can be managed, but they need to be thought about fairly intensely. So how many adults is appropriate for minors? That's kind of a question. Of course, all of you know kids who should never be left alone, and they're 14. They should always have an adult present. Some of the rest of you know some 8-year-olds who could probably run a corporation already. So what is the ratio that is appropriate if you're trying to run a camp or an event? Well, nobody is really sure. But the American Camping Association has ventured a guess. They have said, here are ratios we recommend. And everybody cites these. And so here's the ratios they say. Maybe you can't see them very well. They say, if you're doing overnights and you've got 4- and 5-year-olds, you want at least one adult for every 5 kids. If you've got 6- to 8-year-olds, you can bump that up to 1 to 6. If they're 9 to 14, you can bump it up. This is all available on their website, by the way, American Camping Association. 1 to 8 if they're 9 through 14 overnight. 1 to 10 if they're 15 through 17. Now, I was a youth pastor for a long time. And I've done an awful lot of overnight retreats and trips. I can tell you this would be thin on the ground. I certainly wouldn't want to go any greater than this. 1 to 10 ratio overnight for 13 to 17-year-old. That one person is going to be very, very busy. I assume with 4 to 5-year-olds, 1 to 5 would be plenty to handle as well. Day camps, they'll let you go up a little bit because you're not trying to manage overnight, but they say still 1 to 6 for ages 4 to 5, 1 to 8 for ages 6 to 8, 1 to 10 for ages 9 through 14, and 1 to 12 for ages 15 through 17. Now, in a classroom, a good teacher can manage 12 students fairly easily. But that's also in a classroom where they're seated down. If they're running around in a camp situation, I think these would be minimums. I think the problem with a standard like this, and why more people haven't tried to put this out, is once it's out there, then it's something a plaintiff's attorney can point to and say, well, you ran a camp. Did you know that the American Camping Association says that you should have had at least a ratio of X, Y, and you're going to have to explain why you didn't. Now, on the other hand, like I said, in my personal opinion, these are too thin as it is. I'd want more than this. So if you're planning a camp with ratios different than this, you need to be able to explain, maybe explain in court, why you didn't have at least this many trained staff people. Does this make some sense? Anybody have any quibbles with this or thought, yes, that's absolutely right, or no, it would be more or less? How many people run a higher ratio than this? You wouldn't have only 1 to 12, you'd have 1 to 10 or 1 to 8 if they're teenagers. Yeah, what do you run for ratios? Can I ask?
Little kids, we have 1 to 4.
1 to 4, and what's little? Under what age?
5 and 6-year-olds.
So 5 and 6-year-olds, you run 1 to 4, and you're fairly comfortable with that?
Well, it's 1 to 4 at a particular table, and then we also have roaming adults.
So you have actually more than that, really. Would you be comfortable with a 1 to 5 ratio for 4 and 5-year-olds with no roaming adults?
Nope.
Yeah, so anybody else here do athletic camps? What do you run for ratios? Have you thought about it much?
Not in terms of like housing needs or whatever, as much as like instructional needs
Right.
and just trying to work with them on whether it's at a basket or a goal or a station or that sort of thing.
Do you guys do overnight camping much? I used to think that was no big deal. It's kind of nice to have them. And then I got my insurance broker actually said, hey, my kid's in your basketball camp. And he called up last night and asked me to bring him a pillow because he didn't have his pillow. And I thought, I'm sure we sent him off with 2 pillows. He says, I went to your dorm at like 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock last night, dropped off my son his pillow, and I saw no adults anywhere. The whole place was just one huge pillow fight. And that's why he needed more pillows. He burst the previous 2 and needed another pillow. And he said, I lectured him and told him not to waste this pillow in a pillow fight, but I never saw a single adult, and all these kids were just massing around. I'm sure the adults were all off exhausted, having a nice, cool beverage somewhere, but they left the kids untended, and that was a nightmare scenario for me as a risk manager. Not even just with all the sexual assault stuff, but just in general with leaving kids unattended. So if you have a policy, do you have a, yeah.
Generally, I think we shoot for 1 to 10 overnight, and then part of the deal.
What age group?
What's that?
What age would that be?
That's probably 14 to 17.
Okay. High school-ish?
High school. So, and part of the deal is if you work camp, you also are, you have dorm responsibilities in helping with supervision. Okay. The problem, and I want to hear your answer, is you've got adults who are in the dorm, using the same living spaces, using the same showers. How do you deal with that?
That's right. That's a big problem. And I think I mentioned that somewhere in one of the slides coming up, that how do you do mixed ages, especially adults with kids? It's a risky kind of a thing. Most schools I know will have policies for at least 2 adults present anytime. You never want an adult alone with a child. It's just hard to justify if the child accuses you of something. So that's really difficult. Some schools have just gotten away from overnight camping like this, overnight in the dorms. Summer camps still do this all the time. They manage with counselors and so on. But you got to have excellent training and excellent oversight. So expectations are really clear. You might be that you'd have to have a separate time or place for the adults to go and shower. And you got issues in our culture that didn't used to be here that are important, or at least they weren't as commonly talked about. And that's a really big concern. I think I'd want to have really well-trained staff and lay out the expectations. Do you have a policy on minors somewhere on campus? Some of you are asking questions that would typically be in that kind of a policy. Penn State University ran into a lot of press a couple of years ago when one of their former football coaches was accused, the Jerry Sandusky case, of abusing some kids. And he was convicted and sentenced for a long time. Penn State was also fined by the NCAA, I think it was $63 million, for not managing their minors' interactions well. $63 million sounds like an awful lot of money to me, but it turned out it was not a random number, it was symbolic. That's the amount of money that Penn State took in from home football game revenue in a single year. So it was 1 year's home football revenue, which sounds like a lot to me, but it was sort of a slap on the wrist to them. And it's interesting, I was talking to the risk manager from Penn State, who's a very nice guy. Kathy and I have known him for a long time. He told me, Vince, our policy at our institution on minors was really good before. And after all this stuff, we revamped it a little bit, and it's better, but it was pretty good before. Our problem was that nobody, A, knew about it, and B, was following it. And that's what got us into trouble. If we'd been following our own policy, we wouldn't have gotten such problems. So another thing, though, that's come out, many schools have come out with policies on minors, and I strongly encourage you to uncover yours and dust it off, especially for your staff. There's now a required training piece, part of Title IX, in sexual abuse prevention that could be minors. Many schools have changed their policies from being policies on minors to being policies on minors and vulnerable persons. So I put that down as MVPs. The reason for that is we're starting to see problems with things like Special Olympics or elder care, or if you have nursing home kinds of things. We're seeing people, a vulnerable part of the population, who are being assaulted or attacked in ways that we had thought of more for minors. You think of adults able to react, defend themselves, whatever. But several schools have been changing their policies to be policies on minors and vulnerable persons. Do you do any work here with nursing homes or with elder care or with special needs folks at all? You do special needs? The people who are involved in special needs folks, whether they're minors or not, they're not competent to take care of themselves under the law. Your policy on minors and vulnerable persons should apply there as well. So the background checks, the training, that kind of stuff. And that goes for outside groups that come in too. Here's the difficulty. If an outside, say a church wants to come and rent some space from you, and your policy in your contract says, hey, you need to have insurance that identifies the university. If you're going to come use our space, that pays us back if something goes wrong, and we want sexual molestation coverage in there because you're working with minors or vulnerable persons. You're bringing kids on our premises so that we don't get sued as the premise owner. We want you to have sexual molestation coverage. And the church says, sure, sure. However, there's one small thing that most insurance companies require if you're going to ask for a sexual molestation protection coverage. Anybody know what that is? It's something you talked about with your HR people at the beginning of this afternoon. They want background checks. How many churches do you know that do background checks on all their volunteers? Some do. Anybody here? How many people go to a church that does that? 1, 2, or know of a church? How many people are pretty sure their church they know about doesn't? Yeah. If you're going to be renting space, churches should now, unfortunately, but if you're going to be renting space, you need that. But I know most churches, they're short on volunteers for a youth retreat. They'll say, oh, shoot, at the parking lot, could you mind coming with us for the weekend? Sure, I'll hop on the bus, all right? Well, there's no background check on that person, and that would void their insurance coverage. So that's one thing to think about when you've got volunteers at camps, too, outside camps. You may think your contract says, yeah, they're required to have this kind of coverage. But if they didn't do background checks on their volunteers, and the chances are decent they didn't, even if they meant to, then you might have no coverage and you think you do. So that's worth thinking about. Another factor that we want to talk about is what the definition of minor is. This should all be in your policy if you have one or when you develop it. How you screen them. Who is a mandatory reporter? If you saw a child and suspected they were being abused or needed psychological care or needed some kind of protection, who here would be a mandatory reporter with the state? Anybody know? How many people know you personally are a mandatory reporter? All right. Can I ask why? What is your role that you know you're a mandatory reporter? And NPs are definitely, medical personnel are mandatory reporters. Anybody else who had a hand up over here? When you worked in a preschool, yes, preschool teachers definitely are. Most ministers are. I was, when I was a youth pastor, for sure. Mandatory reporters are required by law to report. Doesn't mean necessarily report to the state, although it does for some of these roles, but to report within your system up to somebody else who reports if there's suspected abuse. If you see a child with unexplained bruises or other kinds of things, you should train on how to identify that. Many schools have gone to saying, look, I don't care what the state of Tennessee says. Every single employee of Lipscomb is going to be a mandatory reporter for abuse. If you see it, you say something, even if it's just above you in the chain. So I would encourage you to consider a policy like that for kids and vulnerable persons in general. Make sure the training happens. Make sure that you know what you're going to do if somebody's accused of this, how you're going to proceed. If you had a summer camp and everything's going really well, and then all of a sudden one of the kids said, so-and-so touched me, you will immediately get an education very quickly on what investigations are all about and what reporting is all about. It'd be really nice if you had training on how to avoid that ahead of time and what to do if. So I would encourage you as you're planning events or working with outside groups. Sometimes outside groups are very vulnerable and they don't even realize how vulnerable they are to some of these accusations. You can give them a bit of an education. Sometimes if you don't feel they can be educated enough, you need to say, look, I don't think we can partner with you for this. There are certain problem areas that are always kind of the ones that pop up for special events. These are areas at other schools especially that we've seen big problems. Alcohol and controlled substances is always a big way to have problems. It sounds like Lipscomb's contracts and code of conduct say that's not going to be an issue here. That's great and saves a lot. If you have unclear ownership of the event, if say you're partnering, let's say you had a basketball coach who was running a summer camp for basketball players all the time, but it's your basketball coach, and they're getting a paycheck all through the summer on a 12-month schedule from you, and yet they're running this camp under their own name, it may not be entirely clear if something went wrong there, whether that is a Lipscomb project or a basketball coach project or both. Especially if, as often happens, the basketball coach recruits some of the basketball players to come work at this camp, and maybe it's part of their NCAA, practice hours or whatever. You got to be really clear on whose event this is. There are three categories. It's either definitely ours, or definitely theirs, or both, joint. And it's really helpful to clarify: is this these people just coming and renting space from us? Are they partnering with us, or is this really our thing? So could you say fairly clearly about the events you know about that's definitely ours, or definitely theirs, or both? Most of you have some notion of that? All right, that's really important for all kinds of things, insurance and contracts and so on. If you have a mixed age group, that's pretty tough as well. I would have certain kinds of categorizations. If you don't collect a waiver or release for voluntary participation, that's important. Now for field trips and things like that internally, you probably cannot collect a release if the field trip is mandatory. If they must come, if it's even varsity sports, same thing. If it's a condition of them playing that they go on this trip, you probably can't. You're responsible to take care of them in that case. You can't ask them to waive their rights for a required event. If it's a voluntary event, yes, you certainly can and should collect a waiver from them. But if it's required, no. You don't want to have improper facilities. I mentioned this kid running around the ping pong table and falling and hurting his eye. Inadequate supervision. unplanned time is different from free time. Free time that's supervised might be, okay, kids, let's go to the gym and you can do whatever you want. Play with the rubber balls or the little scooters or whatever. Unplanned time is say, well, we'll see you at supper time in 2 hours. That's not a good idea with minors at all. And with adults, they often need that. What are your qualifications for your staff? Do you have certain kinds of things? They must qualify as a child care worker. They must be certain kinds of coaching qualifications. Is there regulatory risk? Do you have workers' comp exposure? If you're receiving a paycheck from Lipscomb, you're probably considered an employee of Lipscomb, and therefore you'd be covered by workers' comp for that event. Or not. That you'd have to sort out, but you have certain kinds of regulatory requirements from the state. Because you also have, and from the federal government, you can't bring kids in to do certain kinds of jobs either. Sometimes a physical plant will hire summer workers that are students, and in most states there are laws that say you can't make that child work with chemicals, you can't put them up on a ladder higher than a certain amount, you can't let them work with power tools, certain kinds, that kind of stuff. And so your physical plant or anybody else you're working with in camp needs to know that you have certain regulations on that. And then you need to know your mandatory reporting, as I mentioned. Well, again, there are many problem areas. If the students are coming, especially minors, but if the people involved in your event have pre-existing mental conditions, what are you going to do about that? How are you going to know? How can you keep medical privacy issues and still find out what you need to know about diabetes or depression meds or other kinds of things? Our summer camp in Wisconsin in the last few years at Wheaton has gotten to the point where when the kids get on the bus every other Sunday to drive up, 70 kids on a bus up to Wisconsin, there's a nurse, 2 nurses actually, standing at the entrance to the bus with coolers. And every kid who gets on the bus has to turn in their Ziploc bags of meds labeled. And the nurses take custody of those. And at least a third of the kids have big bags full of meds. So I'm telling you that the students, especially children coming to your events, have medical issues, and you've got to figure out a way to know about them and also to keep that information private, following HIPAA privacy laws. So if you're not doing some of these things already, you need to think about how you're going to manage that, manage the meds, especially overnight stuff. That's really tough. We talked about custody and transportation. What about media images? On your sign-up forms for camps and events, do you have a media policy statement saying, oh, we may be taking pictures of your minor children, and we may use them on our website for advertising? Your signature on this application means you give us permission to do that. Because otherwise, the parents might say, hey, you took a picture of my kid. You can't do that. Take that off your website. I'm suing you. You never had the rights to use my child's image. Now I'm concerned about stalkers. My beautiful child was identified in public on your website. That's worth noting about. Don't advertise in your brochures for things that are overreaching. Don't say, this is the best basketball camp in the tri-state area. Well, if you say that, back it up with somebody else who said that, because somebody says, well, my kid had a terrible time at your basketball camp, and I think your brochure is wrong. This whole shared space, private space issues we're talking about too. Are you going to put 2 kids in a dorm room, 4 kids in a dorm room? You're going to put 3 kids in an adult? Who's the adult? I don't want that job. That's getting to be creepy in this culture anymore. When I was a youth pastor, I wouldn't even drop a single girl off last if I were running 4 or 5 kids home. Back in those days, I used to make sure it was a guy I dropped off last. Now that wouldn't even help. I just make sure I drop 2 kids off last because I have to protect myself as well. I know schools that when they have routes to run for transportation to take people home, they have the driver check in the moment that he or she leaves and then check in at every stop, and so they can account for the time they were gone. So if they had to justify an allegation of something, they could say, no, we've got time checks and all these drop-offs. There simply wasn't time for this person to abuse this child and to travel like this. I know that sounds like overkill, but boy, those are tough defensive cases. If you got emergency management, I hope you do, who here would handle it if you had a missing child? Say you had a summer camp and a child was missing. Where would that call go first? Coach notices there's a child missing. They call who? Campus safety. Anybody here from security, campus safety? So what happens? You get the call. Oh, we're missing a kid from soccer camp. How long? I don't know. We thought we saw them at lunch, but I don't remember now exactly. They were here this morning, but they're gone now. It's 2 in the afternoon.
And after that, you check in with the roommates, see if they are together.
No, I haven't seen him. I think he was really mad this morning. I think he groused about something.
And then if it's within or if it's outside the 2-hour window, then we notify Metro for that low road.
And then what happens? You make the news, that's one thing.
Well, yeah, no, make the coach call the parents.
Yeah. There actually are emergency protocols. That's a smart man. True or false, the parents will be happy. One of the things that every school is supposed to have is a protocol for finding missing students. And that's part of Clery Act revisions, I believe. But I don't know how that applies to students who are not your students, who are campers and so on. But you should have an emergency plan. And if you're smart, you'll tell the parents ahead of time what the emergency plan is. You'll have a website for the camp or an email that goes out or saying, just so you know, here's how we're planning to manage free time. Here's how we're staffing it. Here's what we do if something went wrong. Parents are greatly comforted by that. They feel like, hey, somebody knows what they're doing. Somebody's in charge here and knows what they're talking about. I have a hand-up sheet. One school had a terrible problem with, especially after-school programs or pre-college programs, with something called the entourage effect, where the families would show up to help little Johnny or Susie through the program. And what do you do with 3 and 4 other members of the family, younger kids, older adults, parents, who just want to hover and watch Johnny? You might want to make your application clear about when parents are supposed to be there or not. Schools have become much cleverer with this for orientation because of helicopter parenting. Anybody here in charge of orientation or involved in orientation on this campus? Most schedules for orientation now will, because parents will never go away. They're just, oh, they want to see how, little Johnny does. They'll hang around. So most orientation programs will say, well, we're doing this, and we're doing this, and this, and this is the time when parents get to say goodbye. And the rest of the events are for the freshmen or whatever. And you actually have to say that. It's time to go home now. So if you're running a camp, you might say, from this time to this time is really not for outside visitors. Because it messes up your ratios, they get in the way, that kind of stuff. Okay. Here are some ugly scenarios. Let me ask you guys this as we close. How would this play at Lipscomb? What would you do about this? These are all real cases. A female 16-year-old high school junior on a campus recruiting visit. Where's admissions? Where are my admissions people? They leave? Okay. So she's here recruiting with you all. All right. I don't know whether you got a waiver from her in case she's medically necessary, but she's staying with host students in a residence hall overnight. She was sexually assaulted late at night by another visiting student, a 16-year-old male on campus for a Model UN program. It was sponsored by the Political Science Department for area high school students and hosted at no charge by the institution. Apparently alcohol was involved. Who would field that call? My poor public safety guy, you taking all these calls? A sobbing 16-year-old student says, I was attacked. It's 2 in the morning. Who gets this one?
Probably me.
And what's your role?
The vice president of enrollment.
Vice president of enrollment. And what are you going to do?
Talk to Kathy Davis.
At 2 in the morning?
Yes.
Okay. Meanwhile, sobbing student with public safety, what are you doing with her?
Well, it's a sexual assault case, it's a Clery Act violation. And we're it's a mental health issue as well. So counseling.
So who you call for that?
We have staff on call.
Is there somebody here for that? Yeah, you're on the button for that? Did I see a hand? No? Okay. So I've got at least 3 departments involved so far. You just called Kathy, that's 4. And your attorney, right? 5. Okay, you got 5 people up at 2 in the morning for this. Could this have been prevented? Is this a supervision problem, or is this a... And by the way, notice who's on the hook for paying for this. Let's say that he did really assault her. All right? Who is hosting this group?
If they're in the residence hall, they're going to call the residence hall director first thing if an issue happens with someone within the residence hall. Then we'll go, we're there in the building, living in the building. So
Okay, so
call us first.
you're up at 2 in the morning. All right, you want public safety to call you first. Is it public safety or security or campus police? What do you call yourself? Here.
Security.
Security, okay. So you want security to call you first?
Well, they're
This 16-year-old just called 911. That's all she did.
then we're up because we're going to hear the sirens.
This is going to be a bad night in
Promise you
Blackburn.
that.
Well, this actually happened on a campus I know about. And the problem was, too, for the institution that because they were hosting the poli-sci department, it was their event. Remember I told you about yours, theirs, and ours? They would like to have said, oh, this is the Model UN's group. They're responsible for this kid. But because they were doing it jointly with the political science department, it became the institution's event. And so they were on the hook for the behavior of the 16-year-olds. That was tough. That was a tough claim. So sometimes getting a waiver and release by parents identifying you for the behavior of your kid to participate is important. In that case, you want the UN, Model UN group, and the parents and the institution, all three-way contract to be involved. A sixth grader visiting a campus department on a school field trip was cornered in a bathroom and bullied by two eighth graders from a different school on a coinciding field trip. Kids ever come to Lipscomb on field trips? You have museums and stuff like that? All right, who would get that call? Poor security is on the hook, I think. Well, that's what you do, right? You answer calls. What could you do to prevent that? You may just take that. A good contract at that point, the event just happened, I'd want a good contract, but how often do you let field trips come just for the good of the order, you know? So you might just have to eat that claim and say, well, that's part of the deal of opening ourselves up to the outside world. Finally, during a homecoming open gym activity for children of alumni attending concurrent class of functions, a few bored high schoolers shoved their way into a game of dodgeball set up by volunteer student supervisors recruited by the Advancement Development Division. They taunted the younger kids, many of whom were injured by the force of the red rubber balls they threw. The volunteer supervisor students either did not notice or were unsure how to respond. Alumni parents were outraged when they retrieved their bruised and crying offspring. This is also a true story. It really happened. What could they have done about this one? What's that? I'm sorry. You could have put an age limit on the group. Who enforces that? They had student supervisors, but apparently not well trained, right? What if a lot of the supervision of kids especially is playing what if? What if this happened? What would you do? What if this happened? How could we have prevented that? So these are all real life scenarios. This stuff really happens somewhere. And when you're doing events for the public, other stuff happens all the time. I got a call from a student. We had a concert, public concert, sold tickets to it in our major chapel, and one of the people who wanted to come was disabled. He was in a wheelchair, and our chapel it doesn't have stadium seating. It's got ramps. You know, the whole floor is slanted. So he said, "I want to come to your concert." Well, for access, we had to make sure we could make it accessible. So we pulled out a couple of seats in the back where it was flat, and so he could roll his wheelchair right up there. Pulled out the chapel seats. That was great, except he never showed up for the concert. So it was a big, full concert, standing room only, so a dad brought his daughter, and they stood in the back there where the seats had been taken out. Nice empty spot, and it was a really exciting concert. He kind of stood on the aisle side to protect her from other people, and she was so excited. She's 10 years old. She was jumping up and down, and her thigh came in contact with the edge of the seat that had been taken out, and it was razor sharp. It was an edge there, and just cut her leg wide open, right down the length of her thigh for this concert. That was really tough. What could we have done about that? What's that? I think we just mainly learn our lesson. And we put now caps on the ends whenever we take them out. But that was really, we paid that whole bill. So stuff happens. That's pretty much the size of it. Folks, I hope this has been somewhat helpful. I hope that you have, if you're doing things right, I hope you were comforted. And I hope that if you have some things to work on, you were enough afflicted to try to figure out what you can do differently and better. I hear great things about Lipscomb, and I certainly, Kathy tells me it's a fine place to work, and she's been a good person to work with. Any questions for me at all about other things related to hosting events on your campus, minors, policies, anything like that? This is not the most exciting conversation for a Tuesday afternoon, but you've been with me so far as the choir. Any other thoughts, comments?
If we are looking for some advice on how to make adjustments within our department, whether it's particular policies, how do we go about getting that guidance? Obviously, Kathy is social research. Is that something that she's in possession of all the materials to advise us on making the appropriate changes?
She can, and she can call me anytime. We have a collegial working relationship. One of the things I do at Gallagher is collect information like this from all over the place. And whatever you need, I can get you 8 samples of how other schools do this. I can give you some case studies, some draft policies, things like that. Kathy has that. I can get more of that for her. That's what I'm paid to do. I work for you in that regard. So absolutely can get you more if you need it. Yeah.
You said there was a separate process for a volunteer background check. Is
Yeah, I don't know if I meant that there's a separate process, but there's sometimes a separate depth level, depending on, sometimes it doesn't happen at all. Okay.
I was wondering, how many people are using volunteers in your particular camp?
Do you hear that? How many people are using volunteers in their particular camp for that? Raise your hands
They're
high.
not being paid.
No pay, just volunteers. 1, 2, 3, half a dozen at least. Okay. From a legal perspective, it's difficult to have any difference between a volunteer and an employee. The kid doesn't know the difference. The people you're working with typically don't. There are some important differences from a responsibility standpoint, but from training, I wouldn't train them much differently. If they're working with a kid, they're working with a kid, or other adults for that matter. Other questions or comments? Those are good ones. Thank you, folks. You've been very patient with me on a difficult topic and long-term policy. I thank you for hospitality from Tennessee, and I'll see you next time. Thanks.